Hey, grade 7, it's Miss McDonald. This week in social, we are learning about treaties. So, the agreements that First Nations and the British Crown or Canadian government, depending on the exact timing, who it would have been, that they signed that talked about lots of different things. And those treaties are still in effect today. And so, they are something from far back in Canadian history, but that have current implications in our lives, all of our lives. So to get us started, I am just going to read through the section of the textbook so you don't have to read it this week. And we will talk about a couple of different things as we get to those points. We're going to specifically focus on treaties in the West, even though treaties were signed across most of Canada. And we will get started. So First Nations and Métis were the first groups to feel the effects of the new settlement in the West. On the plains, the buffalo had become scarce because so many of the newcomers were hunting buffalo alongside the First Nations people. In the north, more and more miners were moving in and trappers were coming into First Nations territories. And across the prairies, land that was good for hunting was being turned into farms. So there just wasn't as much farmland for First Nations people as there used to be. Europeans also brought diseases like smallpox and tuberculosis that were especially dangerous to First Nations people who had no immunity to those diseases. Earlier in our social studies, when you've been learning at home, we looked at the Métis and we looked at some specific actions that they took during this time period. And we hinted at the fact that First Nations and the federal government tried to reach understandings through the treaty process, and that the treaty process is something that has been used for hundreds, thousands of years. First Nations groups made treaties between each other, and in other places in the world, agreements and treaties had been made for a long time. One of the differences is that First Nations treaties were always oral. They were always spoken agreements, whereas European agreements were usually written down on paper and signed. As a result of those differences, when First Nations and Europeans started to make treaties with each other, there were often different understandings and misunderstandings that happened. So the First Nations and the Canadian government or British Crown had different reasons for signing treaties. So from 1871 to 1921, the First Nations living between the Great Lakes, so present-day Ontario, and the Rocky Mountains, where we live, made 11 different treaties with the Canadian government. We call these the numbered treaties. The government's main reason for making those treaties was to gain control of the land and the natural resources, to secure the land so that settlers could come and start farms there, and to gain control of those resources so that they could be bought and sold and we could make profits off of them as a government or as settlers that were coming. Government officials knew that if First Nations did not agree to allow homesteaders onto their lands, then the government's immigration plans would fail. At the time, there were wars between First Nations and government troops in the United States, and our Prime Minister, John A. McDonald, did not want war to happen in Canada. He knew it would cause lots of suffering and that violence would slow down the government of Canada's effort to get more Europeans to move to the country and to go west. The First Nations, on the other hand, their main reason for agreeing to treaties was to protect their rights to land and to natural resources. First Nations realized that their future would see even more newcomers, and that First Nations needed food and money that the government was promising. Lots of communities were struggling and threatened by starvation and disease, and they were in really tough situations. The buffalo were disappearing, the Europeans had brought diseases, lots of tough stuff. First Nations also had other reasons for signing the treaties. Some of them saw the treaties as a better alternative than war with the newcomers and war with the government. And some First Nations decided to sign treaties in return for help to set up farms of their own. And a few felt that if they didn't sign these treaties, that their land would be taken from them anyways. Through the treaties, the government promised to hold at least some of the land in trust for First Nations. So the government would control that land, but it would belong to First Nations. The First Nations people thought that treaty negotiations were a way to meet the Canadian government on a nation-to-nation basis. So First Nations were considered a nation, as was the government or the country of Canada. And they hoped that the treaty signing process would guarantee that their people and their culture would survive. There were 11 different treaties signed across Canada, and we live in the area that is considered Treaty 7 land. So Treaty 7 involved 5 different First Nations, the Kainai, the Beacony, the Siksika, the Nakota, and the Tsuut'ina. This treaty was signed at Blackfoot Crossing, that's just east of Strathmore along the Bow River. There's a really great museum there. I would really encourage you guys this summer, if you're looking for something to do close to Strathmore, to spend a day and head out there. They have a museum, but it's in the kind of river valley, so there's really great hiking and all sorts of cool plants and animals that you can see, and there's some interesting little information signs and stuff that you can learn more about this time period and just about First Nations culture and Blackfoot culture in general. So if you're looking for something to do, head out to Blackfoot Crossing. It's about half an hour away and it's a good day. Canadian officials and leaders from 5 different First Nations met at Blackfoot Crossing in September of 1877. Along with those important chiefs and those important government officials, there were about 4,000 other First Nations that came and camped in that area to be present for these treaty negotiations and treaty signings. For 4 days, the government officials and the First Nations leaders talked back and forth about what would be in the treaty, and chiefs also talked amongst themselves. Finally, after 4 days, both sides reached an agreement. In the written agreement, the Canadian government recorded that the First Nations had surrendered 90,600 square kilometers of land in exchange for benefits like yearly payments, reserve land, hunting and fishing rights on unoccupied land, salaries for teachers on the reserve, and farm equipment for First Nations people. The Canadian government thought that they now owned the land. And just as an aside, the government officials and the First Nations chiefs didn't speak the same language, so they needed translators to go between them. And the translators that they got were Cree translators, which up until this point had actually been the enemy of the Blackfoot people. And so there's lots of oral stories about the Cree translators not translating things properly from Blackfoot to Cree to English because they didn't really like the people that they were translating for. So you can see how already there's probably some misunderstandings that's going to happen as these treaties are talked through. The government written document is quite different than the First Nation elders, the oral stories that they recorded in their memories and they told to their families. They say that they had agreed to share their land with the newcomers in exchange for the government's promises to provide for their needs. They did not think the land was sold. So that's Treaty 7. And each of the 11 treaties was slightly different, but the main agreement in all of them was that the Canadian government promised to provide First Nations with cash payments, certain goods like fishing gear or farm equipment, and certain services like education and healthcare. In exchange for those things, the First Nations would allow the homesteaders onto their lands. And certain areas of lands, which are called reserves, would be set aside for First Nations sole use. No newcomers could live there. As I kind of pointed out, as we were specifically talking about Treaty 7, you probably noticed that the Canadian government and the First Nations ended up with quite different understandings of the treaty. And this happened with every single treaty that was signed. At the time, both sides did their best to communicate clearly, but there was a difference in power and a difference in language. So the difference in power, language, and cultural differences made the understandings of what was being agreed to quite different. The Canadian government had another policy in mind that it didn't discuss openly in the treaty negotiations at all. And this was a policy of assimilation. Assimilation means that one culture is kind of forced out or dies out because of the strong influence of a more dominant group. Sometimes language dies out that way as well. The Canadian government thought that as time went by, First Nations would lose their culture and would lose their language and would become more and more like the newcomers, more and more like the European settlers. In order for the government to accomplish this, the First Nations children were specifically targeted by the government. The government separated First Nations children from their parents by making them attend residential schools. They were forbidden from speaking their own language at residential schools or from practicing their own beliefs. And because these kids spent so much of their childhood away from their families, they couldn't benefit from their parents' guidance and their cultural teachings and were cut off from their roots. And earlier this year, we spent a little bit of time talking about residential schools. And residential schools are something that came about in part because of the treaty process and that discussion about education and the different understandings about education that came out of the treaty. So that's my kind of brief overview of treaty for you today. There's a couple of questions for you to answer right now. And then I've got a short video of our school division's elder, Clarence Wolflag, showing you Blackfoot Crossing and the treaty signing site. And then there's a little section for you to work through. It's a Google form where you have to decide if a statement is true or if it's a myth, and go through and see how much you know about treaty, and maybe you'll learn a couple of little things. So thanks so much for watching. I hope you guys have a good week. Stay in touch. Send me a note if you've got any questions or things that we could chat about. I'd love to FaceTime or do a Google Meet with you. So just let me know and we can set that